Thank you. Thanks to Kevin for inviting me. Thanks to everyone for staying. So this is a partly Canadian, partly North American perspective on smart specialization. But I've taken out all of the smart specialization parts, but I'm going to read try to read the North American literature and our Canadian research back into a lot of what I've been reading about smart specialization for the last 3 or 4 years, and particularly what I've heard the last day or two. So we're living in a highly regionalized world, but as some of our colleagues have told us, location matters more, not less. My colleague at Toronto, Richard Forda, uses the phrase spiky, and he charts it in ways that make it look quite dramatic. So knowledge, and this is part of the dilemma for smart specialization, is the incredible disparities in the way knowledge is being concentrated in highly research-intensive regions versus the rest. And all regions, research-intensive versus other ones, are completely susceptible to disruptive change and shocks. That's a quote from Ron Martin that I won't read out. But I just spent a day last week at the leading AI conference in North America, now being held at the Rotman School at U of T annually. What's happening in AI is absolutely mind-boggling. When you hear the researchers present it, when the entrepreneurs starting companies, when you hear researchers like Jeffrey Hinton, who's a pioneer in this field for 25 years, but AI is only one piece. It's the cloud computing piece, it's the big data piece, it's the Internet of Things piece, and now some of my colleagues who we're working with are starting to talk about when 5G rolls out, it will fundamentally change the way we think about and use mobile devices and mobile communications. 5G is going to be a qualitative change in mobile transmission. So these kinds of external shocks fundamentally affect the ability of regions to adapt to changes and to policy conditions. And as we've heard a variety of times, it requires effective institution building at the regional, and I will argue at the community level. Ina Dredger yesterday was the only person I heard talking about RIS3 at the local and the urban level, but I think it has to be an important dimension in our thinking. In the Canadian context, we think about this in terms of multi-level governance. Canada was probably the first country outside of Europe to pick up the concept in the early 90s, carry it across the ocean and start to apply it and use it to analyze it, because it, for a lot of us working in this field in Canada, it reflected the reality of the Canadian experience that we lived in. So, but we use, in work I've done with a colleague, particularly Neil Bradford, we use multi-level governance in a broader way than it's usually used. One of the reasons it's important, it's so valuable is traditional government institutions and concepts of institution, hierarchical, centralized, highly Weberian bureaucratic institutions are, as we all know, very ill-suited for knowledge-intensive economies and innovative activities. They don't deal well with the dispersal of power across many different sectors, across different geographic scales. I had a slide in here which I took out on nested scales, which I like to talk about a lot, of flows back from the local, the regional, the national, to the global, and after. So in order to deal with this complexity of innovation, we need to shift from thinking in terms of government to thinking in terms of governance. And multi-level governance is one part of that broader governance dimension, I argue. The scholarly literature tends to focus on two types. One is nested scales of federalism, which I'm not going to talk about very much, but a little bit. But the other is the more far-reaching, decentralized conception of governance authority with multiple nodes of decision-making at the community scale. And the key challenge for innovation strategies and policies is to link those nodes together in effective ways to tackle collective innovation and economic development problems. So for regional development policy to work at the subnational level, we have to link up the formal type of multi-level governance, the more formal government institutions, but more importantly, to embed the more informal what I call associative forms of governance within the broader institutional. And my colleague, Bradford, argues that for this to work, you need complementary and combined institutional hybrids to coordinate and align governance across different scales. And hopefully I'll expand on that a little bit. We've also done a lot of work on diversity and variety in a big national research project we've just completed. We got quite interested in the question of how diversity and variety affect different patterns of regional resilience. And we know that the greater degrees of sectoral variety reduce vulnerability to external shocks, related variety, and what my friend and colleague Phil called a while ago strange attractors are important sources potentially of resilience. And resilient regions and dynamic entrepreneurs tend to target the white space. Rob Huggins is left. Don't think David Waite's here, but the two people I know I first heard use the white space concept were Phil Cook and Terry Matthews within about 4 or 5 months of each other. Both Welsh, by the way. So it's not as if the Welsh aren't making important contributions. And we've obviously gone a long way farther in thinking about how different varieties of resilience are reflected, and I've stolen some of Michaela's different dimensions and different concepts, and I'm not going to go through it. I'm working on another project right now where I think path modernization may be an underrated but extremely interesting one of these different dimensions that we need to talk about. And I obviously was going too fast because I have it in twice, or I think it's so important I put it in twice. So we have this challenge of resilience, but we know resilience occurs in this path-dependent fashion. But we tend to think of a lot of the literature, the economic geography literature, tends to focus on path dependence in an economic and a structural sense. So we think of the economic development paths that regions have been on, and we say to follow to branching or new path creation or some of the other dimensions, regions need to be able to build on their specialized regional assets, including the research infrastructure, to take advantage of unique concentrations of occupational and labor market skills. The Nokia case in Tampere is obviously an interesting example of where you have strong concentrations, and so the question then becomes the potential of developing and applying that. You need local firms and entrepreneurs who can adjust to changing their business strategies, to changing international circumstances. And you need this strong degree of institutional and organizational thickness. And what I want to focus on more is the institutional and organizational dimensions, because I think that's the dimension that has not received enough attention in a lot of this work. So path dependence clearly plays a contingent role, but it's framed by strategic choices of local actors and the degree to which local institutional structures constrain or support the realization of their goals. So in some work I've done on resilience, I've argued that resilience, we need to think and talk about resilience and path dependency in more than just market-based and economic terms. Resilience involves the interaction of 3 different sectors: private firms, public, governments, and civic networks and associations. And it's the civic networks and associations that brings in the governance dimension that I think has been sorely neglected. And it's one of the areas in which I think North America differs most dramatically from Europe, because the state is so much underdeveloped, especially at the local and the state level. There's a much greater role for associational activity and economic development strategies. And I mean, I'm not advocating a weak state as the solution, but I'm saying stronger associational life may be an important additional contributor. So local governments and governance are central to these kinds of processes and resilience, and regions tend to be the ones in which market and local institutional structures do the best job of adapting to changing environmental conditions and circumstances. I know Kevin just told us that we can't use the phrase older industrial regions, but I had the slides done before he gave us that diktat, so apologies, Kevin. But there are, serious great challenges. Again, these are North American examples. The challenge is that the older industrial centers remain locked into technologies and industries in which they were once efficient. That's path dependence and path decline. So the great centers of the last industrial revolution, Pittsburgh, Hamilton, Akron, Ohio, Windsor, Ontario, Cleveland. You can go through the whole US Midwest and look at the challenges of every one of those industrial cities. And Buffalo, close to where I am, every one of those cities had a distinct competitive advantage based on the industries of the late 19th, early 20th century. Detroit being probably the quintessential example. So they may lag in R&D and research infrastructure. Fascinating comparison in the US would be the difference between Detroit and Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh blessed with 2 world-leading universities. Detroit, most of the great universities in Michigan are outside of the city of Detroit. Wayne State is moving to compensate for that, but I think it's been a challenge for Detroit to overcome the lack. They have a preference for incremental over radical innovation, sometimes have lower R&D intensity, but I would argue that the greatest obstacle is that they may lack the civic networks and social institutions that are needed to forge new governance coalitions. One of my favorite books, if you haven't read it, is Sean Safford's book, Why the Garden Club Couldn't Save Youngstown. It's an absolutely fascinating comparison of the way social networks in Youngstown, Ohio, and Allentown, Pennsylvania, come together to either support or to block the development and the framing of new innovation strategies. Both of them are declining steel towns, and yet the community mobilizes in radically different ways in the two cities. And they're very located very close to each other and come up with very different strategies to overcome them. And Michael Keating and my colleague Neil Bradford like to say that resilient regions are ones that are successful in forging these new development coalitions at the social level. So my only European slide. I was very partial to the initial EU exercise on place-based development policy. I had the opportunity to participate in one of the consultation groups that Michael Storper and Andres Rodriguez-Posey led in Brussels in 2011, 2012, in the lead up to the Barca report. And that was a group that tended to focus on the importance of building institutional capacity. And I'm not sure whether their report, what Michael and Andres ever wrote, was publicly released, but they both published several articles with Tom Farrell that's based on that work that was done for that consultation group. And it's reflected, if you read the Barca report, the work of that group is reflected very closely in a lot of the thinking of the Barca report. So strategies need to be territorially grounded, tailored to the reality of specific regions, so very clearly in the one size does not fit all camp. But it also emphasized the need for better integration and competitiveness and convergence policy. But also reflection that policy interventions need to build on the input, the experience, and the local knowledge of key regional actors. And I'll come back to that. Local knowledge is a phrase that we've used over and over again. And it's knowledge that exists outside of the boundaries of government. So if I were to summarize my take on RIS3 based on everything I've been reading up until yesterday and everything I've heard yesterday and today, I think the transition from Barca to smart specialization, the emphasis on institutional building and institutional capacity building seriously got left out of the equation. Whoever translated Barca into the RIS3 manual, I think my take is they lost that dimension. So effective place-based development policy, we argue, requires social learning. It requires knowledge and collaboration to generate innovations, not just through technological innovation, not just through R&D, but through institutional processes of learning. In a report that American and I did originally for DG Research in 2002 or 2003, we talked about the importance of structuring and creating what Merrick called local social knowledge management exercises. Exercises to formulate and coalesce development strategies, bringing in key local actors, governing beyond governance. And this requires a higher order of learning, what, again, Phil and Kevin, long time ago, 20 years ago, almost called reflexive self-monitoring or learning by learning. But we've gone beyond that in some of the work we've done to talk about 3 learning dynamics. Again, this is work I did about 10 or 15 years ago, and then I've repeated with Neil Bradford. So it requires, I'm going to put them in the reverse order. I think I have the bullets in the wrong order. So it requires policy learning, which we've heard a little bit about. Dylan did a really interesting presentation this morning on policy learning or unlearning in Wales. It requires administrative learning, administrative capacity. But most importantly, I want to argue it requires civic learning, learning by civic associations. So in a lot of the work we've done, we've talked about building new kinds of civic engagement and new forms of government, going beyond government to governance, recognizing that outcomes depend upon the broad range of social actors. I think I heard the phrase or came across the phrase quadruple helix about 3 or 4 months ago, and now I've heard it in almost every presentation. So putting it into European terms, quadruple helix, but it reflects the reality that power is dispersed among a wide range of actors. I think one of the most important things to understand and to reflect in regional development policy is that government doesn't have the knowledge, it doesn't have the capacity, it doesn't have the power to act on its own to solve all the tools. And if we don't find ways to mobilize and engage private and community-based actors in those governance processes, then we're fighting the regional development battle with one hand tied behind our back. So it involves a blurring of the boundaries across the public and the private sector. And for anyone who's ever had the privilege and the challenge of working in a public sector organization, they are not structured to do this. The worst thing you can do in a public administrative job is offer up the advice that government should give up serious control, especially fiscal control, to non-governmental actors in making critical allocative and investment decisions. And that's a big challenge. I mean, that's part of the challenge of policy and administrative learning for governments to deal with. So in a lot of work we've done, we've talked about 10 years ago, I started using the phrase social capital, civic capital. We've been talking a lot about social capital based on shared norms and trust. And I began to feel that the concept was far too broad. It was being stretched too widely. It was being used in too many different contexts: family, firm, community, policy, government policy, to really capture and reflect the dimension that was of most interest and relevance to those of us interested in working on local and regional economic development. And so I started to use the phrase civic capital, and I'll explain in a second how I came to this. But working with a former student of mine, Jen Nellis, who's now at Hunter College in New York, we defined it as this set of interpersonal networks and solidarity within a community based on a shared identity, expectations, or goals, but tied to a specific region or locality. So civic capital, as we've been using it the last 10 or 12 years, is region and locality specific, and it involves a key role that local leaders play in strengthening networks and building linkages within communities. So in terms of the bonding and bridging dichotomy we heard about yesterday, we're definitely talking about bridging capital more than bonding capital. And it can be harnessed for effective regional governance by what Doug Henton, who works in Silicon Valley, has done a lot of advising to joint ventures in Silicon Valley. So what Doug Henton calls civic entrepreneurs, or in most recent work he's been doing, they refer to these as regional stewards. which are not quite the same thing, but these are boundary-spanning bridge builders. So my phrase, civic capital, is really a conflation of Doug Henton's civic entrepreneurs with social capital. That's how I came to this phrase. And if anyone wants a better idea of what he talks about, he wrote what I think is a brilliant book in the US context in 1997-98 called Grassroots Leaders for the New Economy. A wonderful, wonderful discussion of this. So building civic capital is closely linked to these three dimensions of learning, social learning and policy learning. Policy learning requires the ability to disseminate policy relevant knowledge through new governance arrangements. It's a specific form of social learning in our conception that applies to internal government and governance processes. And again, in work that Bradford and I have both done together and independently, we link it to different forms of associative governance. So it involves learning within public sector organizations or agencies, within public sector organizations, within the same network or system, and across various organizations in different networks and systems. And I think I'm taking this from Michael Howlett's work, Michael Howlett at Simon Fraser, but I noticed other people have been using the same typology that I'm using. But it also depends on designing organizational structures in ways that are capable of learning and adapting to what is learned. So if you combine this, I'll begin to combine these concepts together as we've been trying to do. And part of what I'm saying is empirical and analytical, but a huge part of it is prescriptive, and I'm very bad at separating out the prescriptive from the analytical part. So you'll have to query that on me. But this leads you to a bottom-up or user-driven form of innovation policy, defining new ways to formulate what David Aldrich calls strategic management policy by drawing on local civil capital. And in this large project of studying 16 Canadian cities that we did, we tried to study the degree to which this was actually happening on the ground in the 16 case studies we were doing. And my colleagues, Neil Bradford and Alison Bramwell, summarized the findings from that part of our research project and classified the different cities into three different types. Institutional collaboratives, where the formal arrangements were more solid, more established. Montreal in Canada would be the classic example of this. Happy to go on at great length if anybody wants to ask me about Montreal. Toronto starting to move in that direction, but a long, long way to go. Waterloo, they put it in the second category, sector networks. I put it a little closer to the first category. And then project partnerships, which are basically one-off deals where local leaders can come together on a specific project, but they can't institutionalize it and carry it forward. But this, to me, resonates with something Kevin sent me to reflect on, and that is the concept of experimental governance, which you took from Sable and Zeitlin, defined as a recursive process of provisional goal setting and revision based on learning from the comparison of alternative approaches. So where this kind of bottom-up civic engagement is taking place and being built into local and regional economic development policies, I would characterize that as a form of experimental governance in the kind of terms that Kevin and others are talking about. But a key part of this is then building effective collaborative institutions. And this is a term that Michael Porter uses. I'm sure Efor's used it in some of his work. But these are formal and informal. There's a lot of typos in these slides, sorry. Formal and informal organizations that facilitate exchange of information and technology, foster cooperation and coordination. And in our perspective, these kinds of collaborative institutions enhance civic capital by creating relationships and establishing trust. They create, Michael Storper years ago for the OECD did a brilliant paper which is replicated in part in a book that Merrick Gertler and I edited. I think Kevin and Dylan are represented in that volume. Phil is represented. They have a great, but Michael talks about the importance of talk metaphorically as a mechanism for creating this kind of social understanding and social learning and policy learning and building trust. And these collaborative institutions set the tables where talk can take place and occur. And part of what they do is they also identify common strengths, but most importantly, this is where the identification of a common research and economic development agenda can take place. And so if you're trying to build an RIS3 strategy and you don't have the tables with the talk, with the institution building and the collaborative relationships that contribute to civic capital, then you're trying to build an RIS3 strategy with one arm tied behind your back. And I think I've just said that. So I want to switch now and say, so what does all of this have to do with Canada? How does this play out in Canada? Well, we have a highly federalized, highly decentralized system. On the research side, the provinces manage the post-secondary education system, but the federal government funds all the research. Historically, the federal government transferred money to the provinces for post-secondary education, but since the mid-1990s, that proportion has diminished and is almost negligible now. The universities are calling for a reinstitution of it, but I'm not holding my breath. The federal government runs the research enterprise through a whole series of projects, of different government funding bodies and agencies. NSERC is the science and engineering one. They create chairs to promote industrial technology transfer within different universities. CIHR is the medical one, our version of NIH in the US, but they have a whole host of research commercialization programs that they run. The federal government created networks of centers of excellence in the late 80s, early 90s, not identical to, but not dissimilar to the Norwegian ones or the French Pôle de Compétitivité, but they don't have an explicit cluster agenda built into them the way the European centers of excellence have had. But then they've gone on and they've expanded. The conservative government in the neoliberal era expanded these research centers and added on two new versions, Centers of Excellence for Commercialization of Research, what we call CSERs, and there are about 8 or 12 of these across the country. One in regenerative medicine in Toronto is one example. But they've also created what they call business-led NCEs, so business-led Centers of Excellence, where a firm takes the lead and then recruits university partners to be involved, but the firm defines the research agenda. So it's the research managers from the firm who say, these are the research projects we are going to do. They go out and they recruit academics, so they may have academics they've worked with in the past, and they bring them in to work with them. We have been working closely with one called REMAP, which is led by the Canadian contract manufacturing firm Celestica, spun out of IBM about 15, 20 years ago, largest contract manufacturer in Canada. Small by global scales, but it's one of the few Canadian IT firms still involved seriously in manufacturing. And then they've also, through the auto recovery program, Automotive Partnerships Canada was created to bail out the auto companies, but they've also put a whole lot of money into funding research in the automobile sector to help regenerate the automobile sector. We've also got, the thing that complicates the Canadian landscape is we also have a series of 6 federally appointed regional development agencies in the 6 regions of the country. Traditionally, these were European cohesion policy circa 1960 or 1970. So they focused on infrastructure, they focused on building an organizational and administrative capacity, particularly in the less developed regions. Southern Ontario, the richest, most populous part of the country, never had a regional development agency till 2009 because the federal government said it doesn't need one. It's rich, it's prosperous, why should we have an agency? They finally created one in the late 2000s. And over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a really subtle but important shift in the mandate and agenda of these research agencies away from infrastructure funding and capacity building towards making transformative investments for innovation. And and not using the language of path, regional diversification or path creation, but clearly the thinking has moved in that. There's also been attempts to align what they're doing more closely with provincial and local initiatives, a focus on mobilizing knowledge transfer, and evidence of trying to leverage and add value to the regions. Those, I'm going to skip over that. Those are just some specific examples of a couple of the programs, the actual programs run by 4 of the different regional development agencies. But the most important one would be the last one, the business innovation programs that FedDev, which is the agency in Southern Ontario, has. So layer on, so we've got the federal programs, we have, with many different institutional forms, we have the regional development agencies moving into the innovation space. Then we have the province of Ontario, which since 2003 has had one of the most interesting and long-running policy experiments underway. You'll find this hard to believe, but I'm actually presenting a conference paper on this today in Phoenix, Arizona, exactly on this topic of the ONE. Obviously not me personally, but the conference paper is there and it's being presented by my collaborator. So this started out as what was called the Biotechnology Cluster Innovation Program in 2002. That was to target 11 biotechnology clusters in Ontario. We don't have 11 biotechnology clusters in Ontario, but the program was targeting them. It quickly evolved into a regional innovation tech transfer program, originally called the Ontario Commercialization Network. Then it became the Ontario Network of Excellence. And finally, in 2013, was changed into the Ontario Network of Entrepreneurs. It has 17 regional innovation centers, RICs, located all around the province. I'll talk about this in a moment. Mars is the linchpin of this. It's a large, huge institution in downtown Toronto, right next door, but probably the most dynamic and innovative in the whole network. It's Communitech based in Waterloo, and it is the one the other one that I'm going to talk about and work with. And then layer onto this, we've had a virtual explosion in the last 5 years of commercialization centers and business incubators. Mars is the largest and most dynamic. Waterloo has 2. There's an accelerator center linked to the university in Waterloo Research Park on the northern border of the campus. The Communitech Hub, which I'll talk in more detail about, in downtown Kitchener, the older industrial park. And I'll explain the Kitchener-Waterloo dimension. We have just an outpouring of undergraduate entrepreneurship programs. So the University of Waterloo Velocity program is probably the most innovative and dynamic. They create a residence where first-year students coming to the university who want to be entrepreneurs move in, and everyone they room with for the 4 years of their undergraduate education are all there to start firms. Like, everyone's going to university with the explicit intention of becoming an entrepreneur from day one. And they created a Velocity incubator for the undergraduates in the larger incubator in downtown. And the Ontario government, through the ONE, through the Ontario Network of Excellence, has now created a program called the Campus Link Accelerator Program to fund entrepreneurship training and to create incubators and accelerators across all of the university campuses in Ontario. U of T has, I say 7 here, we may be up to 9 now across 3 campuses. One of the most interesting is the Creative Destruction Lab at the Rotman Business School. If you're going to be there in a couple of weeks, E4, get them to give you a tour of that. This is the group that put on the AI conference in Toronto last year. I've interviewed serial entrepreneurs from Toronto who worked with them, were part of the mentor group that worked with them, and this one of the serial entrepreneurs said to me, this is the most dynamic, most effective model for scaling up firms, helping firms grow and scaling them up that he's ever seen. And then we have this phenomenally successful one at Ryerson, another university in Toronto, called the Digital Media Zone. So, but the bottom line is that you have this this is all unplanned. All of these programs are designed and created in traditional government bureaucratic silos. Each of them reports to their own program managers, separate departments, separate agencies, all of them with their own program objectives, all of them with their own funding envelopes, all of them with their own reporting requirements to Treasury Board officials and finance officials in terms of effectiveness. What's missing is what we would call joined up governance on the ground. There is no government body or agency that looks at how all these layers, federal, regional development, provincial, local, university, come together on the ground to create regional innovation opportunities. But what we're starting to see is where you have these dynamic groups of local actors, there's a white policy space that opens up. I think can I copyright that, Phil? These white policy spaces are opening where you get policy entrepreneurs at the civic level moving in and taking advantage of opportunities. I'm going to do this in reverse order. I'm going to talk Waterloo first and come back to Mark. So Waterloo is the one where this has been done the most. It's a small economy. It's 3 cities, 500,000 people. Kitchener was the traditional manufacturing center. Automotive moved in with the Toyota plant about 20 or 30 years ago. But then the university came along, created great strengths in computer science, electrical engineering. It has advanced manufacturing. It also has an old residual financial services sector, particularly in insurance, that hasn't gone away. It has very, very strong research infrastructure, 2 universities plus a very dynamic community college, technical training college, which comes up an awful lot in the interviews we've done. But interesting, even though the focus is on the university, when we interview firms in there, they tend, one interview we did many years ago, and it used the phrase, we do big D and little r. So the tendency tends to be on development, incremental innovation rather than radical innovation, development and enhancement of new projects, and some sort of related variety of combining new and different technologies of existing firms. But it has the most dynamic civic capital I've seen in any of the cities and regions we've studied in Canada. It's the closest you'll come to a Silicon Valley kind of civic capital north of the border. And it's had a very cohesive development coalition for 20 years. And it's a coalition, or 25 years now. It's a coalition that was originally built by 7 or 10 local entrepreneurs who banded together to create a group to lobby for more bandwidth originally. All they wanted was better broadband. And then it gradually grew and evolved, and it's become an incredibly innovative local organization. What they do that I find incredibly fascinating, and government people, some government people understand this, a lot don't, is they will define a project that they want to establish at the local level, and then they'll figure out which government pots of money, federal, provincial, regional, they can go to get the funds to do what they want to do. And they will twist themselves into pretzels if they have to fit their programmatic goals into the funding requirements. But they're defining what they're going to do. They're not letting the stated objectives of the program define what they do. So the strategic use of federal and provincial resources to enhance the local and the regional innovation capacity, and increasingly they are moving into areas of white space. I mean, there's just Google some of the firms, Myovision, ClearPath Robotics. There's some incredibly innovative startup firms that are scaling up and starting to do incredibly interesting and innovative things in the Waterloo space. So they've created their own version, I would argue, of smart specialization. And the embodiment of it right now is this Communitech Hub. I won't go through all the details of it, but it was built with really strong local partners, OpenText, Christie Digital, Agfa Healthcare, Comdev's a telecom firm, Tech Capital Partners is a local venture capital firm. Probably the most innovative thing they've been doing is they established a corporate innovation hub, where they bring large established companies, Canadian Tire, Thomson Reuters, General Motors, Manulife Financial, into the incubation hub to work with the startups. And the way they're selling it and pitching it to them is to give the large corporate firms a flavor for how to deal with and work with the startups and how to begin to think in a more entrepreneurial fashion. They started with 4 or 5. I think they're up to 20. Thomson Reuters was in about 2 or 3 years ago, just announced they're moving 400 key R&D intensive positions to Toronto, partly as a result of their experience of working in the Communitech Hub. But in my language, they've used federal provincial resources to create their own version of RIS3. And in Jane Jacobs, I love this picture because the Lang Tanning Company in the 19th century was the largest tanning operation in the British Commonwealth. And this is a 19th century building that used to be a tannery. They've taken it, they've repurposed it. It's the home of their innovation center. It used to have the headquarters of Google Canada on top. Google has recently moved to a new building that would be about here where my hand is in the picture. And Desire to Learn is a very, very successful Canadian educational learning software company that's also in the same facility. So that's the bottom-up community-driven version of a successful local innovation strategy. This is the opposite. This Mars, I'll do the picture first and then come back to the text. So this is the Mars Center in downtown Toronto. The red part in the middle is an old hospital building, part of the Toronto Hospital that was basically abandoned in the late 1990s. It was slated to be torn down. 2 medical entrepreneurs, John Evans, founder of Alex Pharmaceuticals, Cal Stiller from London, Ontario, got the bright idea to turn it into an innovation center. It sold it to the Ontario and the federal government, raised money to build it. It was built in phases. This is the newest phase, just completed and opened. A lot of government, a lot of research and wet labs in here, but really important, Johnson & Johnson has just opened one of their first J labs in there. The University of Toronto has taken 4 floors of this building and now is a part owner of what's called Phase 2 of Mars. It's right on the border of the campus, so close to all the medical facilities. If you run south on University Avenue, it's where all of the concentration of teaching and research hospitals are. Toronto has the 4th highest concentration of medical research personnel of any city in North America. We don't turn it into commercialized results, but Mars is partly there to do it. The original title was Medical and Related Sciences, but they quickly realized they were moving far beyond medical. They have clean tech, they have ICT. But the other thing, so it serves as a keynote for the One Network that I talked about before, but it has all these related. They have their own incubator. They have the Home to Mars Innovation, which is a tech transfer organization, but it's funded under the federal government CSER program. So they're combining funds from the provincial programs, the O&E program. They're combining funds from the federal program. They have Excite as one of their own programs, which is an accelerator program for local firms. The Investment Accelerator Program is funded by OC, the Ontario Centres of Excellence, which is part of the O&E. We have too many acronyms in Ontario. J Labs, as I said, has moved in, and Autodesk has just taken the whole ground floor. Autodesk is the large graphing software firm. I'm actually done, Kevin. I've got 1 slide. So, what are the lessons from all of this? In my humble estimation, beware of Canadians coming to Europe on your hospitality and offering policy lessons. So that's the caveat emptor part of the presentation. Effective regional innovation strategies start with bottom-up institutional capacity building. That if you're going to design these, and I think we've heard that in different ways. I'm not sure I'm telling you anything you haven't learned through the Smart Spec program, but maybe our collective government partners need to hear this. that civic capital and regional stewards are the glue that will hold quadruple helix relations together, that we need to draw these external partners, civic actors into, I've heard quadruple helix explained in a variety of ways. The way that I don't hear it so much is the way that I'm talking about, of bringing external civic actors into the smart policy mix, building on their embedded knowledge, their local knowledge, to revise and transform challenges. So the ongoing policy challenges. One is to bring about more effective intergovernmental policy alignment. One of the things I hear smatterings about across the ocean is how do all the expenditures under the Smart Specialization Program and DG Regio align with all of the initiatives under Europe 2020 and DG Research. And I gather rumors are that all is not happy in Brussels, and there are internal tensions within. So I think, and we have those same problems in Canada, but I think what some of the examples that I'm showing you demonstrate is that even though the governments may not collaborate effectively with each other, it's possible for community actors to build the networks and the linkages among the non-aligned government programs and to create more effective policy alignment and effectively teach governments how to do it. And if we had good, effective policy learning mechanisms in place, governments would learn from how their programs were actually being used on the ground and revising and reforming them. We need to focus on transforming the business and community capacity for innovation through these social learning processes. And the final lesson, I think, is I think effective RIS strategies have to be grounded in cities. The region set the institutional framework. It's the region that constitutes the regional innovation system. The innovation is taking place in cities. It's not taking place across the whole regional level. It's taking place in Cardiff. It's taking place in the Basque cities. It's taking place in Tampere. And you need to think about how those strategies get reflected and played out in cities. Thank you for your patience.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. Time for questions.